put the recording on. So now we are recorded, just so we know. And by that, I would like to welcome you all to the webinar on Dynamics in Simplicity, how to respond to the new reality. So I'm the director of the host, the Renan Hui Silicon Valley Center in Silicon Valley. It was founded in 2020 as a response to my thought that business schools are too slow in adopting a new management curriculum. So I suggested that we were to create a new center focusing only on the new management curriculum for a digital age and for the 21st century. Our mission is to support forward-looking executives and, of course, leaders on all levels in managing their organizations in this 21st century. And we do this by offering front-edge webinars like this one and certificate courses. And for more information about us, you can always go to the website that I've been providing you in the chat window. So you just go to menlo.edu and Executive Ed. And with me today, I have three people that I admire highly. They all strive for the same purpose and same thing as I do, I think, namely to educate the world on the absolute latest trends and practices in management. And I took part of Kathleen's work and David's work already in the early 2000s, and they were already out then and described a new management model and emphasized the need for management, a need for management to change. I was a latecomer at that point in time, but I was very, very inspired by Kathleen's work and of David's work. And later on, I met Stuart Craner, who is the founder of Thinkers 50, and is helping the world, I would say, to understand and emphasize the true thought leaders in management. And both Kathleen and David were chosen in 2020 for Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. And I should also say that David Teese is today the chairman and principal executive officer at Berkeley Research Group. And Kathleen Eisenhardt is the professor of strategy at Stanford. And then, as I already said, Stuart Craner is the co-founder of Thinkers 50 and also professor at the IE Business School. And by that, I would like to hand over to Stuart Craner that will moderate this session, which I hope will be a dynamic and hot discussion between maybe the two absolute leading management thinkers in the world right now.
Thank you, Annika. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers 50 and your moderator and guide for this hour of ideas and insights. This session will provide you with inspiration and practical ideas on how to respond to the new reality. Our speakers today, as Annika says, both have a stellar reputation and track records of providing managers and leaders with the tools they need to succeed. Our format is simple. Both our speakers will present for around 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion on the issues they have raised. So please send in your questions and observations anytime during the session in the usual Q&A box. Feel free to raise your hand as well. I'll be paying attention. Our speakers today, as Annika said, are Kathleen Eisenhardt and David Teese. Both are members of the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame, which celebrates thinkers who have had a positive and long-lasting impact on management practice. First to speak today, after a controversial coin toss before the event, will be Kathleen Eisenhardt. She's a professor and a faculty member in the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Her most recent book with Don Sull is Simple Rules, How to Survive in a Complex World, which explores how simplicity tames complexity in business, life, and nature. She's also co-author with Shona Brown of Competing on the Edge, Strategy as Structured Chaos. So I think we can learn a lot about structured chaos at the moment. So please welcome to the virtual stage, Kathleen Eisenhardt.
Well, thank you so much, Anika. Stuart, I appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for joining us this morning or this afternoon or this evening or whenever. Let me go to the traditional screen share and get us started. All right. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about today is simple rules with some work that I did with Don Sull. So a shout out to Don, who's at MIT. I want to start out with a battle scene. It's the story of a sergeant, Edward Montoya. He's a medic. He was in Iraq. And on Christmas Day, he was in the line for his dessert when the boom of all booms hit. And there was chaos and injury. And as a medic, he's obviously the first responder. And he's faced with a tremendous amount of complexity and chaos and who to treat. And what he does is not some sort of complicated algorithm, but falls back on the simple rules of triage. Couple of rules that help him distinguish who can be saved, who can not be saved and how to give them palliative care, and who can be saved only if he treats them right now. And so in the battle of, in the chaos that ensues, he uses simple rules to make that choice of who receives care. And I want to argue that that's also, as if we're going to see, doesn't seem to be advancing. Let's try that. That's so odd. Let me get off screen share and see what's wrong with advancing.
Mhm.
Let's see if this works. Yeah, there we go. So we were back at Edward Montoya. We're now going to Janet Yellen, crickets, and Mark Zuckerberg. And why I have them up is because they also live in a world of high complexity, and how do they simplify it? Janet Yellen is the new US Secretary of Treasury. Crickets, because not so much that their world is so complex, but if you have a small cricket brain, it looks pretty complex. And Mark Zuckerberg trying to cope with a number of issues, including antitrust and how to keep hate speech off his platform. And what I want to argue is that all of these peoples or animals use simple rules. Simple rules are shortcuts that save time and effort by focusing our attention and simplifying how we think. Let me give you a couple of more of a deep dive into simple rules. The first point is that simple rules are simple. Only maybe a handful, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6, 7, but small. Secondly, simple rules depend on the person and the situation. So David's rules are not necessarily my rules. And third, simple rules relate to a repeated activity. They're not for simple rules for getting married, presumably, because that's not a repeated activity, at least not more than 2 or 3 times. But it refers to other things like hiring, partnering, and so on. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is Michael Pollan and his simple rules for diet. So what does Michael Pollan, the author, have to say about dieting? He has a couple simple rules. Eat only foods that your grandmother would recognize, meaning unprocessed natural foods, but only what your grandma would know. Number 2, eat not too much. And 3, eat mostly plants. But within that set of rules, you can be having blueberries, kale, whatever. So a wide variety of things as long as you follow the rules. Second point is that simple rules depend on who you are and the situation you're in. So for example, the Stanford football team has simple rules for diet as well. And they are always eat breakfast because 20-year-old guys often sleep in and rush to class. Stay hydrated because they're extremely active. And number 3, eat as much as you want, as long as you can pick it, pluck it, or kill it. So if you think about that, Michael Pollan's eat not too much and Stanford football's eat anything you want is different because they're obviously 2 different, it's middle-aged man versus 20-year-old athlete. But they're also sort of the same in the sense that eating only what your grandmother would know is the same as pick it, pluck it, or kill it. So it's fresh ingredients. The third point is that simple rules refer to a repeated activity. So again, not getting married, not buying a house probably because you don't routinely do that, but things that you do repeatedly. Choosing foods, for example, which you do every day. or in the comparison that I have on the slide, choosing crowdfund projects on two well-known platforms, Indiegogo and Kickstarter. And Indiegogo and Kickstarter, while both being crowdfunded platforms, have distinct rules for what projects you can put on there. For example, Indiegogo is an anything goes platform. Anything goes as long as it's legal. So you can try to fund your European trip when we all get back to normal, your healthcare for your parents or whatever. By contrast, Kickstarter is focused on a curated selection of 12 categories, and projects have to have some sort of design or art aspect to them, reflecting the art curation background of the founders. So that's simple rules in a nutshell. Let me dive a little bit more deeply. First of all, simple rules from a business point of view or a personal one are focused on a critical process, something that's important, something that's keeping you from accomplishing what you want to do. So simple rules center on a critical process associated with strategic success. Why do they work? They work because they balance efficiency and flexibility. You can be efficient, only eating plants, for example, but you can be flexible, blueberries or kale. They help you make better decisions because they help you focus on what's really important, not too much information, and simple rules let you remember, even if you're under stress, you're busy, you're tired, you can still remember them and do them. And simple rules in an organization give superior coordination across a broad set of people because they're easy to communicate, easy to remember. Let me give you a couple of examples. Simple rules at Google. Simple rules at Google for hiring computer scientists. That's a key bottleneck for Google to be successful. What are some of the rules, at least some of the rules that started Google going? Was hiring CS people, obviously some of the usual stuff like, write resume or write school or write GPA, but also always hiring people who are eccentric, a juggler, somebody who spent a year in Nepal, somebody who's a stay-at-home dad. Because the idea is that eccentricity is correlated with creativity. The second rule is hire people that other Googlers refer to. Because the idea there is Googlers know what good Googlers look like, and they want great people to work with. And then the third one was around never hire anybody who's got even a hint of deception on their resume, because we want highly ethical people. Within that, then you can start narrowing down the thousands of resumes that you get to the people you actually want to interview. Different set of rules, Airbnb. Again, some early rules were around hosts. Hosts are obviously a critical process. How do you manage hosts? And if you think about the problem, you're trying to manage hosts who may own a villa in Spain, may have a camp out spot in New Mexico, a variety of accommodations and hosts and nationalities. So what are a couple of simple rules for managing hosts? Because you've got all these diverse people. One is professional photos of the property. That differentiates Airbnb, for example, from Craigslist, which at least here in the States is a more low quality kind of listing. Secondly, always have local touches in your property. So for example, passes to the local art museum, directions and time for the local farmer's market. Something differentiates you from a hotel. A concierge isn't giving out hotel passes and directions to farmers markets. And then finally, kind of an interesting one early on was clean soap. You want a clean house, but what's something that sometimes after people have vacuumed and dusted, they've forgotten to do is change up the soap. And it turns out that people actually want to go into a bathroom that has fresh soap. And that's just sort of a quirk that many of us have. Final example is creating the rules. And this is about a company called Zizi. It's actually an Eastern European company, and they own a number of cafes, or they operate a number of cafes in Western corporations doing business in Eastern Europe. And those Western corporations want to give their employees, the ones that use the Zizi service anyway, high quality food. So healthy, nutritional food on site. But what Zizi was finding was that it was becoming increasingly expensive to do that. And then they investigated the problem. The problem was in part that the chefs at each cafe were ordering ingredients that may or may not have been in season. But when they're not in season, they're expensive. The chefs were enjoying creating novel recipes and doing new things all the time, which also was not particularly efficient. And so what they did is go from the sort of expensive way of running their cafes to working with chefs to come up with some simple rules. The simple rules were: fix the menu by Wednesday noon the prior week. Number 2, 3 out of your 5 daily dishes have to be bestsellers. Number 3, 2 of your 5 bestsellers, 2 of your 5 meals in every cafe have to be the same across cafes. So it's got to be bestsellers, same across the cafe, but still leaving some room for individual creativity. And then finally, about 85–90% of your ingredients have to be locally sourced or fresh. What was the result of this? After probably, I believe it was around 9 months, 140% revenue increase, doubling their profits, and a year and a half later, they had tripled their number of cafes. And so the point is, they went from a highly expensive, barely profitable business to, in fact, a very, very profitable business by using simple rules. So that's the story. Simple rules work because they let you be flexible but efficient. Simple rules work because they let you decide things quickly, taking advantage of the fact that people can only remember a few things. When they get tired, they can follow the rules. When a lot of rules are proxies for other rules. So for example, eat food that only your grandmother would recognize is in fact a proxy for a variety of kinds of rules about food. And finally, simple rules let you coordinate across many locations, whether it's ZZ Cafes or whether it's Airbnb hosts. So with that, there's a quote from Leonardo: "Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication."
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm not sure you encountered my grandmother's cooking.
Well,
Yeah. So thank you, Kathleen, for explaining how simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Just a reminder to send in your questions and we'll get to them after the next presentation. Now, we're going to move on swiftly to our second guest, David Teese. David is an academic, consultant, and entrepreneur. He describes himself as a scholar entrepreneur, and his entrepreneurial track record, it makes for very interesting reading. He's a professor at the Haas School of Business and director of the Center for Global Strategy and Governance and faculty director of the school's Institute for Business Innovation. He's also co-founder of the Berkeley Research Group, an expert services and consulting firm. He's a pioneer of the dynamic capabilities perspective, defined as the ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environments, like the one we find ourselves in now. I think our current situation certainly fits the description of rapidly changing environment. So, David Teese, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And it's always an honor to be on the same panel with Kathy Eisenhardt. And we share a lot in common. In fact, we both contributed significantly to this literature on dynamic capabilities. So therefore, I couldn't say no to an invitation from Stuart to talk about dynamic simplicity, because on its face, it seems a little bit paradoxical, because dynamic worlds are highly complex worlds. But of course, what Kathy's telling us is that there's a great benefit to simplicity. And she put up a wonderful quote from Leonardo da Vinci about the elegance of simplicity. And at the top of my slide here is a quote from Einstein, which says something similar: everything should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. So there we begin with a little bit of a rub between what the two of us are saying. But as you will see as I move through this, and next slide, please, there's a lot of complementarity between what we're saying. So I agree with Kathy that the world is characterized by deep complexity, uncertainty, volatility, and her first slide was on the military. And indeed, the military came up with the term VUCA to describe the kind of complex environments that not only is the military face, but business faces today. Of course, we cannot escape, in some fundamental sense, this complexity unless, as businesses, we accept government regulation. That would stop competition, but it would substitute market volatility for political volatility. So one way or the other, we're trapped. And so we have to deal with management under complexity and management under deep uncertainty. And my bottom line here is that in these dynamic environments, indeed, simple rules can help. In fact, they not only can help, they're necessary, but they're not a panacea for everything. And in fact, Kathy was clear about that. She said they relate to repeated action. And of course, not everything in a complex world is about repeated action. And dynamic capabilities itself deals, yes, with circumstances of repeated action, but it also deals with the unique and the new. So where I'm going to lead you is to the view, which is my last bullet point here, that strong, or what I call high-level dynamic capabilities, require reasoning from first principles, especially with respect to what I've called sensing and sense making, and also with respect to strategy. So the bottom line here is, yes, if it's repeated action, simple rules are elegant and necessary. But if it's not repeated action, what do you fall back on? And I'll give you some clues as to what I think the answers are. Next, please. What are the benefits of simple rules? Kathy gave us a good overview of this, and she is in fact the pioneer in terms of telling the world about the benefits of simple rules. But I do want to point out that there's two aspects that at least I see in simple rules. And one is that it can reduce self-generated, or you might want to think of that as artificial complexity. And we'll make a lot of complexity in organizations, much of which is unnecessary. And simple rules is one way to escape from that, if you will, imposed complexity. And indeed, standard operating procedures, which of course I don't think of standard operating procedures in the main as being dynamic capabilities, but they are necessary for running the business on a day-to-day basis. And indeed, they do help us in economizing on bounded rationality. If you don't have simple rules for repeated tasks, you're going to burn a lot more brain power than is necessary to get the job done. So at the bottom there, I agree with Kathy. Simple rules are suitable for recurring and identical processes. And so in the language of dynamic capabilities, they're critical and essential for lower level dynamic capabilities. Next, please, Annika. What about creativity? Well, I think sometimes, but not always, simple rules can stand in the way of creativity, and creativity is necessary for strong dynamic capabilities. And the basic point here is that rules, and of course, Kathy is alert to this because in her writing, she talks about the need to modify rules over time. But if you're not as good at modifying them as you are at creating them, you can quickly generate rigidities in the organization, which can in fact stand in the way of dynamic capabilities. So if we have to move forward, we have to learn to take things apart. Otherwise, we get trapped by the world as it is. And when the environment changes, either because of technological change or political change, then simple rules must be modified, and they must be modified very quickly. Some might say you have to throw the rule book out at such points. In the Schumpeterian language, if you are at a punctuated, or if you're at a disequilibrium, or if you're periods of punctuated, if there are epochs of punctuated equilibrium, whenever there's a new punctuated equilibrium, you've got to create a new set of rules. And indeed, my colleague at Berkeley here, Charlotte Namath, has pointed out that it's the troublemakers that are actually very important in organizations because they reject the rules. And so there's a role for the troublemaker because they can help move along the rule book or perhaps get it thrown out and rewritten. Next, please, Annika. So as I've thought about this, and I really I'm pleased that Stuart got the two of us together around this topic because it caused some of my own thinking to crystallize a little bit. And I remember the distinction made way back in the 1950s by the Nobel laureate economist Charlie Koopmans. And he distinguished between structural uncertainty and behavioral uncertainty. He didn't say much about it. It was just a passing comment. But frequently a passing comment by a Nobel laureate is enough to provide a research agenda for a scholar for the rest of their lives. And as I understand Koopmans, structural uncertainty is that which is really coming from a state of nature, sort of outside the organization or the economy. And behavioral uncertainty is that which is induced by human behavior itself. And so I've come to the view that Kathy's focus on simple rules is particularly apt for behavioral uncertainty, the uncertainty that's self-generated in organizations, whereas dynamic capabilities, particularly higher level dynamic capabilities, are necessary to deal with the structural uncertainty. Next slide, please, Annika. So just to summarize this, low-level dynamic capabilities can be assisted by simple rules because they provide guidance through choppy seas and give you flexibility. And as she pointed out, it enables you to do triage if you're on the battlefield. But higher level dynamic capabilities rest more on being entrepreneurial to forge a new route into the unknown. And how do you get there? Well, I think if I listen to the folks that have to manage in this environment, and particularly Elon Musk, he's being quite explicit that the way he does it is by reasoning from first principles. Next slide, please. So what is reasoning from first principles? Well, I don't think it's simple rules, although Kathy may tell me otherwise, and there certainly are some principles to it. So one principle, one simple rule, I suppose, of first principles is my first bullet point. You break the problem down to its basic element, and then you reason from the ground up. But there are certain logic is important, of course, but I'm not sure this collapses to the notion of a simple rule, or certainly not a routine. But it does allow, reasoning from first principles does allow managers to cut through the fog of shoddy and inadequate reasoning to see opportunities that others miss. So being entrepreneurial is not so much about simple rules. It's about looking at everything all over again, looking at it at an elemental level and then building up. And to quote Aristotle here, in every systematic inquiry, where there are first principles or causes or elements, knowledge results from arguing about these. So that is the mantra that I want to suggest. Next slide, please. Let's take Elon Musk. If you're on your way to Mars, there's no simple rule book. And in fact, what Elon Musk did was throw away the existing rule book and start afresh. And I suppose you could summarize it and say he's certainly creating simpler ways to get to Mars by using reusable rockets and so forth. But there's not simple rules. And maybe after we've done 20 trips, after he's done 20 trips to Mars, will be in Kathy's category of repeated action, in which case, yes, it'll be down to simple rules by then, if not before. So Musk's approach is to reason his plans of actions and adjust based on what he learns. It's constant experimentation. And to use the cooking analogy again, it's the difference between a cook and a chef. Cooks practice routines or rules, chefs innovate. And indeed, the example that Kathy gave was one of cooks, essentially, I think more than chefs. The chefs may create the rules, the cooks follow them. Next slide, please. Our sponsor here, the Rendon Hoyi Center, reminds me, of course, about hire. And I just want to end with a comment that the self-organizing approach, in a way, helps you manage complexity. That's what Rendon Hoy is about. And I suppose the simple rule is decentralize and don't try and capture everything in a rule book for a large organization. Maybe there are many rule books for many units, but I think the general point is that there are other ways to manage complexity too, and decentralization can sometimes help, at least in the speed of decision making. Next, please. What about strategy? This is the one that Kathy has been provocative on, not so much today, but I did read in some of her work that you could use simple rules for strategy. And Michael Porter might agree, because at least he has a cookbook of rules, but quite frankly, I've been rather critical from time to time of that cookbook. Certainly, if you follow Rumelt, you have a strategy kernel. There is diagnosis, guiding policy, and coherent actions. But are they simple rules? Well, the categories. But then if you dive in and do the analysis, everything is very context dependent. And it is true that over time, companies may figure out certain, if you will, guardrails to their strategy and to their decision making, and simple rules can help implement strategy. So I've come to the view that simple rules can sustain a strategy and help construct a guiding policy, but there's much more to strategy than policy, and there's much more to strategy than simple rules. Yes, create value, capture value, navigate obstacles to progress. They're not rules in a way. I think of them as broad-based generic action plans, but inside that, there's a lot of granularity, and there's no simple rules inside the simple categories. So I think there are limits around the strategy formulation process to simple rules, but that's not to say that there isn't a place for simple rules, but I see it more in execution than I do in the creation of strategies. Next, please. Well, that's it for the meantime. I've got a few more slides in the appendix, but I'm out of time. And I'd love to see what questions the audience has got bottled up, or Stuart's got bottled up for us, and we'll take it from here.
Thanks very much, David. We're playing at a very high level here. Aristotle, Elon Musk, Charlie Munger in one slide, a trio I never previously imagined, plus Kathy on Leonardo. It strikes me are the different cultural attitudes to simple rules and complexity. You quote Rendon Hoy, and the higher example, the Chinese white goods company. I visited Haier many times. It always strikes me that they're very comfortable with ambiguity and complexity in the way that Western managers, I don't think are. Are the different cultural responses to your ideas, Kathy?
Different cultural responses. I haven't seen different cultural responses. I have seen that certain cultures are more hierarchical. And so the simple rules are coming from the top as opposed from bottom up. So we might see Scandinavian companies that I've worked with, it tends to be more bubbling up from the bottom of what the simple rules might be. Some of the more authoritarian, top-down kinds of cultures, South America, some of the Asian countries, it's more coming from the top. But the concept of simple rules, which is actually embedded in a larger set of ideas, but I think, I don't, and they're also, well, and so I don't think, where they come from, I think somewhat differences culturally. The other one is maybe some of the content of the rules as well. Certain cultures may favor one kind of rule over another, but not particularly a big difference in terms of culture.
One of our viewers, Rod, points out that rules are not always followed, as the current situation rather demonstrates, social distancing and wearing of masks.
They're more likely to be followed if there aren't too many. I think when there gets to be a tax code of 300 pages, who's following it? By contrast, if there's a smaller number of rules, I think people are more amenable. And again, as David points out, rules do change over time. I mean, what was the great rule 3 years ago may not be a great rule today.
It'd be interesting to hear both of your perspectives on how the pandemic and the events of the last year have challenged and changed your thinking. David?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And it's, if you come back to Schumpeter, punctuated equilibrium, we're moving it to a new position. And when things change so dramatically, then the rules of how you work, of course, change. And my own rules have changed. Most all of us are not going into the office, and that's not necessarily forced anymore. So yes, when there are deep disturbances, you get to think about new patterns of behavior and new routines. And the rules change. And these rules are often just in the air. They're not written down, although I didn't necessarily read Kathy to say they're written down, but they have to be articulated and they have to be understood. So yes, change does require that the rules be modified. But at the same time, it doesn't tell you everything about what to do. A pattern of work and a pattern of engagement is not necessarily the totality of what you do. I mean, my life is not governed by rules. It's mainly outside of rules. That's not to say that there isn't a place for rules. And, every new problem I tend to think of through first principles, the reasoning from the bottom up. Sometimes that's automatic. Sometimes it has to be staged.
Kathy, how has the pandemic challenged your thinking, do you think?
I think the pandemic has, I agree with David. I think the pandemic's created an opportunity for people to rethink their rules. I was working with one company in the UK that was thinking about how can we come out better after the pandemic, and started to think about what kinds of simple rules could we use. So things like, let's follow government guidelines. So let's do that. But let's also, second kind of rule for management was, well, how can we also make this period not just a negative, but a positive? And so having sort of periodic fun things that they do as a group and their management team. And third, make safety a priority. So make safety in terms of acquiring PPE for not only their employees, but if there's extra PPE for employees' families and so on. So trying to rethink, okay, how do we do better in this environment? And using this new environment. And no doubt this new environment will change the way we do a number of things. My neighbor who works at Google, his car hasn't left the driveway in months. So I think it is going to change, and I think we're going to be rethinking our rules in response, not just of the immediate pandemic, but going forward, how that changes.
Jovin Hurry from Finland says, do we need a pandemic to get us to sit straight and look into current rules? I think the answer is yes.
I was working with that had a bonfire. They took all their rule books and had a bonfire, which I thought was kind of fun. And then started rethinking, okay, now what are really our rules?
But that's where leadership comes in, Stuart, that, people will follow the rule book until there's something that interrupts it. And the leadership of the enterprise has to be alert to the need to change those rule books. Otherwise, you get into this, iron cage problem, and organizational transformation becomes necessary, but is very, very hard. The reason why organizational transformation is hard is because of rules. So, unless you have a fully articulated theory of when and how to change the rules, simple rules doesn't get you very far. Even though it's...
But you've been up in hyperspace and haven't actually told us how people do vision. Come down to reality.
Okay.
Because I actually agree with you on thinking. I think there actually is a role for thinking, and I've been doing a lot of stuff with ventures right now and interplaying thinking and doing, and I totally agree with you actually on first principles. But I think it's, talking about Elon Musk going to Mars is a little bit up there.
I'm up in hyperspace, but that is where dynamic capabilities is. Ordinary capabilities down where simple rules really work. So yes, simple rules are necessary. That's ordinary capabilities. Dynamic capabilities, yes, to some extent, but generally not.
Kathy, David makes the argument that simple rules are better for behavioral uncertainty rather than structural uncertainty. Is that the case, do you think?
I think I think simple rules are, when you're doing a repeated process, I think simple rules become more strategic over time. People start to learn what's more strategic. There are times when you change the rules. There are times when it's to your advantage to change the rules. So for example, if you look at network television here in the States, Netflix changed the rules. The whole business model is a rule change. Rethinking that traditional television was weekly series, often a half an hour, a particular format of writing, and really changed up the rules so you could binge watch using movie studio actors, using movie directors, and really reformatted the way we watch television. And that was thinking through the old rules and creating the new rules. So I think a number of entrepreneurs, in fact, do think through what the rules should be. Another thing about thinking that I've noticed I've been working a lot with entrepreneurs these days, is that the better entrepreneurs see a bigger picture. So when they look at an industry, they don't just see rivals, they see buyers, suppliers, and so on. So they see an ecosystem. It's like a soccer, as we would say in the States, or football in Europe, or other parts of the world. It's like a midfielder. You have a bigger perspective. I think the better leaders have that bigger perspective. The other thing the better leaders have is they have a better understanding of the fundamental economics of their business. So if it's a marketplace, they understand the way a marketplace works and how that's different, for example, than an ecosystem. So I think there is a role for rethinking rules and making that a strategic opportunity. And I think the leaders who do that, they have a bigger view, like a midfielder, and they understand the fundamental economics of whatever business it is they're in.
Well, Stuart, if I can just comment on that, I think that what Kathy is saying, and I would agree with this, is a business model in a way is a set of rules, and that yes, you've got to modify the business model from time to time and with some frequency, and that's what Netflix has done. So I'm not sure we need the language of simple rules. In some sense, if we say, look, business models can remain stable so long as the environment remains stable, but you constantly need to update them. And indeed, they are, to some extent, a set of rules. So are we saying anything different from the fact that the business model needs revision from time to time, and that the essence of operating a company is standard operating procedures? It's back to some extent to March and Simon in the Carnegie School, where standard operating procedures, I suppose, Kathy, are the quintessential case of simple rules.
Standard operating rules are routines. Simple rules are simple.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point. I'm not sure I see the difference between routines and simple rules.
Routines is rigidity. Routines is do this, do this, do this, do this. Simple rules is a couple of guidance. In fact, and your point on innovation, innovation comes from constraint. Most people are innovative because they're facing some number of constraints. So for example, great artists like Monet had constraints. And constraints are, if you have constraints, you have to work around them, and that makes you more creative. So a whole bunch of rules does not make you creative, but no rule book at all just makes you floundering. And Elon Musk, for example, has rules, and it's first principles and so on. So he is a creative guy with a small number of rules, and his rules just happen to be better than the rest of us, and he's probably smarter than the rest of us.
Sure.
What about, David talked about sensing and sense making. And it seems to me what you're saying there, David, is that tuning into the context is important in the dynamic capabilities perspective. But I think the simple rules view of the world as well, understanding the context is crucial as well. So the question is how can and should managers do this?
Well, with respect to sensing, there are some simple rules, which is, let's collect information, let's use crowdsourcing if possible, let's listen to customers. There are simple rules, but sense making, I'm not so sure that's really amenable to simple rules. That's where thinking from first principles, I think, is more relevant. But I'm interested in how Kathy would see it.
How I say that again? I'm sorry. I got distracted by chat, which is always a terrible thing.
I make a distinction. The sensing really boils down to sensing and sense making, quite frankly. And sensing is what's going on, collecting information right on, from the center of the environment to the periphery of the environment. But once you've got and collected all that information, how you make sense of it, how Steve Jobs saw the opportunity for the iPhone and Nokia didn't. I don't think it came from simple rules. I think it came from a deeper understanding and thinking in a very elemental way, reasoning from first principles about how to build an ecosystem. So yes, there is part of sensing that is subject and amenable to rules, but there's a good chunk of it that's not.
Right, and I agree with that. I mean, I think creativity is partly the sensing and the data, as you point out, and it's partly thinking through it from first principles, from analogies, from experience, from something else, from talking to crazy people. I agree with you. I think there are aspects of it that aren't simple rules, and sort of, I'm not boiling down the world into simple rules, although I do think a few rules typically makes people more creative.
Okay, let's go back to some questions and comments. Paul says it took more than 10 years to come up with our purpose for our company. It seems so simple today, and yet the processes to get there were not. A question from Rod: how does one identify when simple rules are needed? Are they most for any situation and project, or more for problematic, complex issues?
Yeah, simple rules are more for something that you do repeatedly, so not a one-off issue, and that are important to what your business is. For example, the idea of hiring computer scientists as Google is absolutely at the heart of what they do. For a long time, acquisition was the heart of what Cisco did. For consulting firms, it's again hiring. So I think it depends on situation. Another company I was working with recently had some industrial accidents. Safety became a critical process to think through. And actually in that company, the situation was they had so many rules that people weren't following the rules because people just, I don't get it. I'm just doing what I'm doing. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, Burak Goran raises the issue of complexity. And I think it's kind of an elephant in the room, isn't it? With when you go to leaders in companies and talk about simple rules, Kathy, I can imagine them responding saying, yes, but our business is hugely complicated, and you can't possibly, nobody could possibly understand. Simple rules just wouldn't work here. And I think the thing about complexity is really interesting, because I know companies are global and there's lots of technology, but are they really the situations more complex than they were 50 years ago? Or are they just different? Are we just kidding ourselves that the world is so complicated?
Well, I think ever since I can remember, we've all been saying how the world is getting faster and more complex, and I'm not sure that's true. Although I would say certainly the AI revolution is pretty dramatic. In terms of companies, the companies that I talk to typically want to talk to me. And so they see their problem as some process isn't working. I was working with one biotech company where they were having trouble with some of their partnerships. And so we went in and I said, okay, let's start thinking about, let's write a list down of all your partners. And then just, if you looked at this list, what would you say what were the rules that you would have chosen this list? And the team themselves came up with, oh no, our rules would have been pick a partner who's not as good as they used to be, pick partners that we can bully. And they said, that's not the right rules. And then they proceeded to start thinking through some of their more positive partnerships and how those worked. And some of the guardrails, as I saw in the chat, some of the guardrails for what is a great partner. Again, not a million rules, but a couple rules.
What about the issue of complexity, David?
Well, yeah, you can't dial it all out of the system. If it's self-generated, you can, and that's the elegance of simple rules. Dial out unnecessary complexity, and of course, when you think about it, a bureaucracy is about rules, but it's usually not about simple rules, and a bureaucracy is about complicated rules. But let's come back to Kathy's comment that she frequently gets called when a company's got a process that isn't working. Once again, that's sort of into what I think of as ordinary capabilities. And yes, indeed, When a process isn't working, simplification is likely to be some part of the answer. But that doesn't in and of itself yield a dynamic capability. So I think we're agreeing that there's a place for simple rules, but as complexity gets ramped up, and I do believe that globalization has led to increased complexity because, you know, in some sense, the economic system has expanded and has disparate components that are far-flung, and companies operating in different environments with different regulations, with different levels of government support. So complexity is on the upswing, all the more need to try and manage it in some fashion. But as I'm trying to say, the most manageable bit from a rule point of view is that which is induced by humans themselves inside the organization.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt that regulation and that sort of thing increases complexity, and there's not a lot you can do about from the executive point of view. And in fact, maybe that's the reason for the rise of the populist sentiment and the more bringing things back to a national level is decomplexifying. I'm not sure that I agree with that, yes or no, politically, but that may be part of the driver, that it's too complex to deal in 50 countries or 100 countries.
Do people get promoted for promoting simplicity, or do they get promoted for talking about complexity or making things more complex? I think that's what it boils down to, doesn't it?
I think people get promoted for seeing the world in a new way that also they can execute on and show the results, but in a way that people can understand. And so a simpler vision with it also ends up with results, I think, is what people get promoted on. Again, to go back to the Netflix point of view, I think we all admire Netflix, at least aspects of Netflix, because it was a fundamental rethinking of, as David points out, the business model. But the business model was ultimately about some rules around production. And how that changed. But it was the simplicity of it, it was the boldness of it, and it was the success of it that is why Netflix is a FANG stock.
Well, Netflix has got Bridgerton as well. Yeah.
Pardon me?
Netflix has got Bridgerton. David, where complexity and simplicity in your world? I mean, people don't get promoted for simplicity or promoting simplicity. I don't think. Do you agree?
Actually, if I'm the chief operating officer and I can get rid of a whole bunch of complex rules and I bring in some simple rules, I'm going to get some productivity increases from that. And yes, I can get rewarded. But what the flip side of that is, it's actually sometimes CEOs and others, or the chief financial officer, that starts imposing all kinds of reporting requirements down through the organization and complexifies everybody else's work. So, you know, in a professional services firm, I can tell you, if you can create simple rules of operation to make people's life easier, you'll get promoted for that. In other organizations, maybe not. But as Kathy's initial quote indicates, you know, there is elegance in simplicity. I mean, a good lawyer, by the way, you know, and let's think about contract law. I mean, sometimes, you know, keeping it simple really helps in terms of, you know, crafting a contract that's very workable. So yes, I think you can get promoted on simplicity, on simplifying things, but that's not what necessarily gets you into the office of the CEO, although Tim Cook may be the exception.
Yeah. Leonard Armstead points out, says, a vision, a goal, or a milestone is maybe not a simple rule, but gives some guidelines. So what is the right thing to do, building trust and supporting the right actions? Do you agree, or is this different? Is a vision or a goal different from a simple rule?
I think there are a vision can be a simple rule. If the vision is stay close to your customers, that almost is the point of platitude. It doesn't really give people much guidance. So I think simple rules, I think vision can sometimes inspire people. It maybe needs to get a bit more granular and a bit focused on something to be a simple rule. That's not to say visions aren't important and they aren't inspiring. But I think there's also, from the simple rule point of view, you have to bring it down to something a bit more specific.
What's the role of visions in your worldview, David?
Well, let me first of all make a comment on your prior question, because it sparked an interesting thought. When it comes to risk management, there are certain simple rules. Don't do acquisitions if you're a professional services firm, or if you're a bank, don't lever more than X amount. But at the same time, there's a distinction between risk and uncertainty. So one thing that I will put onto the table here for us all to think about is simple rules work better for managing risk than for managing uncertainty. Uncertainty is about the unknown unknowns. Risk is where you can attach a probability to it. When you can attach a probability to it, yes, I can create a simple rule to manage it. But if it's deep uncertainty, no, you can't. So that was not really a direct answer to your question, but hopefully it will provoke some discussion.
Yanka has a related question. How can simple rules work in companies with a strong culture of risk avoidance?
Good question. That's a great question. And I think it starts with a particular process and maybe a particular set of people. Unless it's a small company, you don't change a company overnight. It's parts of companies, a division of a company, or a particular function area. I'd say getting together and getting people to start thinking about what are the rules that matter for us. And maybe starting it from the bottom up, and trying to have people come up with their ideas. Again, one company I told you about the bonfire, they burned all the rule books, came back a month later and said, okay, what rules did we really miss? What rules did we actually still do, and what did we just forget? We wrote the rule book. Other times you may have to lead from the top. Other times it may be, if you're in a really truly risk averse culture, the leadership has to come in and say, we've made our world too complicated, we've made our world too slow. Let's simplify and let's try this. And it's usually an ongoing process, at least initially, and then revisiting as situations change, like COVID or whatever. So I hope that gives a little bit of insight.
I'm afraid. Sorry, David, your final word from you.
Yeah, risk aversion is about a rule which says no too often. So you cannot embrace uncertainty with simple rules, but you can manage risk with simple rules. And a company that is too risk averse is one that has rules which say no to too many things.
David, thank you very much, and Kathy, I think you could talk all day and discuss these issues.
I could, yeah.
I think we agree that dynamic simplicity, one way or another, is the way forward. And,
thanks so much, and appreciate the fun being on the panel with you, David. Thank you, Anika, Stuart, and everyone out there who's hung in here for an hour. So appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Apologies for the ones I didn't get to. And now some final words from Anika.
So thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, David. It did become a hot discussion. I loved it. It was some friction there. It was also a lot of collaboration. You are, in my view, two of the absolutely leading management researchers in the world. This was fantastic. I do think that there's space and a place for both frameworks, both for dynamic capability framework and for simple rules framework. I actually use both, and I do think they complement each other extremely well. I also think that there are different kind of rules. In my own research, I've seen rules being used to transform companies. Focusing on strategic shifts of a company. I've seen them in innovation work. I've seen them in a daily practice where they have to, like an emergency, they have to be able to quickly know how to navigate. So I do think that there is a clustering of rules that we can see. I want to thank everyone to attend the webinar, and I also want to friendly remind you that there are other webinars coming up. Next one is coming up on March 9th, and we are going to discuss winning in the digital age, leadership and management for the 21st century at that time. So if you want to join again, yes, please go to the website and register. And again, thank you so much, both Kathleen, David, Stuart, excellent as usual. And I'm very blessed to have you in my ecosystem. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
You.